Tēnā koutou katoa. It's really an honour to accept this invitation to speak in a school of government, which seems a very long way for a chemist to have come, as Nick's just alluded to. And it's been nice to learn a little bit about Sir Frank, too, from his Wikipedia page. And I'm disappointed not to have met his nephew tonight. So I wasn't quite sure who'd be here or what you might want to know. I'm aware of the late hour and the risk that you're taking, because after being the Chief Science Advisor for 6 years, the University of Auckland Whakaari generously gave me a whole year's research and study leave to think deeply and slowly and write a book. And now I'm standing here between you and the apparently quite good snacks. So I'll try not to tell you about the whole book and finish up with some time for questions. But I thought maybe this crowd might like a taste of 3 things that I've covered in the book. One is the guiding principles that we used the whole time I was the Chief Science Advisor. So I will introduce you to my friend Rita. And then I've done a bit of reflecting and simplifying, I guess, of when science advice is more effective. So we did some projects that sank like a stone and went down like a cup of hot soup. And we did some that were quite good and landed well, and the recommendations got implemented. And so I've had a bit of time to think about, okay, why was some of it more effective than others? Was it the way we did it? Was it the topic? Was it how we did it? Is there something we could learn that might help others trying to use evidence to inform policy? And then lastly, and I'd love to carry this conversation on with some of you in the audience after the talk, I've been trying to develop a checklist for researchers and policymakers that scaffolds a conversation about how to get evidence into policy. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'll just give you a taster of a few, depending on how the time's going. And maybe it's useful, maybe it's not. And I would love your views. So Rita, just after I found out I was going to be the Chief Science Advisor, this article that I've referenced on the slide was fortuitously published in Nature, 4 principles for synthesizing evidence for policy. And they were rigor, inclusivity, transparency, and accessibility. I rearranged the order because I like the acronym this way. And also because I think scientists in particular, and I'll use the word scientist because that was my job title, but I use it in the most inclusive way possible. I think scientists are very big on rigor, and I think maybe we overcook it sometimes. And one thing I've been reflecting on is that the instinct to put equal weight on the other 3 principles, inclusivity, transparency, and accessibility, was a good one. And of course, that's all about building trust. So I'll just reflect on each of those briefly. Of course, and I'll say this up front and out loud before somebody tells me off for not being rigorous enough, if you do evidence synthesis that's not rigorous, it's likely to be bad science, bad research, and that's likely to be bad for policy. There is a reason why scientists are hung up on rigor, because it's important, because it's why we get out of bed in the morning, because we want to do things properly. So if you're going to take that rigor from the lab or from the social science scenario into policy, ideally you're going to synthesize a comprehensive body of evidence, you're going to appraise its quality, you're going to analyze it systematically, you're going to get it peer reviewed by all sorts of different wise people, you're going to correct it, and then it's going to be perfect. But likelihood is you're not going to have time to do that. And likelihood is you're going to have to draw a line when it's good enough, and there's going to be some judgment involved in that. And if there's one thing I learned during my time at the Marsden Council and then later in this role, it's that rigor is like beauty. It is very much in the eye of the beholder. So one man's rigor is another woman's error, and vice versa. And there's all sorts of frameworks, theoretical frameworks that people use to address this problem of a shared definition of rigor across disciplines. But I decided not to try and frame everything we did in post-normal science or transdisciplinary science, because nobody really knows what they mean at the coalface, but rather to try and build communities across disciplines to solve complex problems. And you need people in those conversations who understand that their definition of rigor is not the only definition of rigor, and you're going to have to make some compromises and see what's useful and when. Of course, as you do that, you need to be really aware of uncertainty. And part of uncertainty is this nasty business of data bias and skew. So we live in a world where evidence is lumpy. We have a lot of evidence in some areas and not much in others. Sadly, the places we really need the evidence are often the darkest. And we need to be able to explain that skew in the evidence landscape without opening it up for politicization. So I prefer the word skew to bias, because the minute you say bias in the building across the road, you're off the pitch. You're supposed to be the science advisor. So the best analogy I have found to explain this to anybody is, imagine you go to the pub, and somewhere between the pub and your car, you've dropped your car keys. It could be a good thing in some cases. You are now retracing your steps from your car back to the pub to try and find your car keys. And you instinctively look under all the lampposts. Now, there's no reason why your keys should be under the lamppost, but that is the only place you can see. And that's really the problem we have getting evidence into government. We only look under lampposts, and we need more lampposts. We need to light the way. So often we haven't got the evidence that we need. And the scientists clinging to rigor, saying there isn't any evidence, it's not strong enough, can mean we get hoisted on our own petard, because that's very easily politicized. So if I had a cookie for everyone minister or MP I've heard say, well, there's no evidence, so we're not doing that, I would be even larger. So you can let evidence be a barrier to action if you get too precious about rigor. And it might be better instead to say, okay, policy direction set, we live in a democracy, let's just evaluate that intervention and pivot and try and focus on making a new lamp to get more data for the next intervention. So inclusivity speaks for itself. Obviously, what we'd like to do is identify and make a use of a full range of evidence. Really easy to say, really hard to do. You can partly address that with a range of skills and people. You can, of course, look at the experiences of other countries, and you can set yourself up with an explicit challenge to find different voices, to find different worldviews, to use different knowledge systems. I think that being inclusive means including stakeholders, it means including policymakers, it means including everyone with a view. Some will challenge that for an independent office because they take independent to mean isolated. But so long as you understand your independence and you are listening, but not necessarily doing as you're told, I think you can walk that tightrope. So when we did a project on commercial fishing, we spoke to people who commercially fished, not a universally popular decision, but we did it. And I think that the project was stronger for it. Similarly, I think an explicit challenge to the established norms of evidence hierarchy is useful. There's a huge bias in the system for the quantitative. I think that a huge amount of valuable evidence for policy just can't be graphed. People have lived experience. People have worked with troubled communities and have deep, deep practitioner expertise. Communities often know what's best for themselves. Of course, once you start admitting those sorts of bits of evidence, someone will hit you up in the Corrie Lounge and tell you that that's not science. And so it's really important to contextualize that cited wisdom. I didn't really mind whether it was science or not. I did mind whether it was useful. And I did mind whether it had been cited with the right degree of rigor. So if some stakeholders had some really great ideas and no evidence, they put a couple of stakeholders suggested this. Wouldn't that be nice to explore? It wasn't that we were backing them or giving them more weight than they were due, just that we were capturing all the information. And that did a couple of things. One is that it put all the information in one place and made people feel heard, and then we could distill a shorter report later. And the other is that it captured some really good ideas, which would have been lost if we hadn't been inclusive of a broader net for gaining wisdom. Also made our reports ridiculously long, for which I apologize. I think acknowledging and discussing the role that values play in framing questions is important, and we often did that in our context section, because the reader it helps them if they're primed to understand who's going to shout at what if they do certain things. And of course, emotion is a big part of how people choose between policies. So having common sense around expert panels was not always easy to find, but invaluable when we found it. Transparency was the one I was really naive about. So I imagined we could work completely in the open. It has obviously huge limits, and I'm in the School of Government, so you knew that already. You can be absolutely transparent about your methods. You can always document your methodology. You can always carefully caveat your limitations. And I think it's really helpful to explicitly pull out points of context and complexity, not necessarily even to take a side, but there were some rabbit holes in some of our projects that we went deep down into, so we understood why people were arguing. We didn't solve their argument, but maybe we moved them a bit closer together by unpacking the other side of the argument for them. I thought we'd be sharing everything all the time. Of course, we couldn't. We could share our terms of reference and our processes, and I learned to be careful about when to share progress. I hoped we'd have a process that would solve that for us. It didn't. It needed a judgment call case by case. And sometimes, as I'll get to, it was really helpful to keep blurting out what we'd found. Other times we kept quiet until the target audience had read what they needed to read. I didn't always front the media, notably in COVID. I didn't take the podium, unlike some of my counterparts overseas. That was because of that last point. It was really important to be in the room and to be candid about the evidence. And I didn't want to be standing in front of the microphone saying no comment, can't say. I was only going to stand in front of that microphone when I could be open and transparent. So a good example of when I did front the media was a fairly terrifying interview on RNZ the day we went into the level 4 lockdown, where Lisa Owen grilled me on the scientific basis behind it. If I'd done that the day before, that would have put me in an odd position, especially if the evidence became contrary to the political direction later. But afterwards, it worked out fine. And finally, accessibility. So in the article I cited, accessibility referred to making the work easy to read, including the search terms, which we failed to do. If I had my time again, I would include them, that sort of thing. We broadened in the office accessibility out to include other facets. So as well as using nice graphics and making sure that people understood it and we had it on the web, we wanted to demonstrate that we were accessible. We wanted to openly listen and engage, not go in with an agenda, listen to all views. And finally, and importantly, I think as people fret more and more about social media, I think although it is quite tiring, it's important to be personally accessible. You need to talk to people one-on-one sometimes, be they decision makers, policy makers, stakeholders, the guy in the pub, whoever. Of course, there's a caveat on the public, especially now that science bashing has a certain niche appeal, so you have to be a bit careful. But I still think on balance, fronting up and talking to people and looking them in the eye is important. So with those principles in hand, we did all sorts of different projects, as Nick mentioned. I think in the book there's 15 different case studies, and we've had time to have a think about when science advice is effective and when it isn't. So my number one conclusion is not quite visible because it's being recorded, sorry, and that is that the most effective science advice is just, but not too far ahead of the policy agenda. So if you've got officials, politicians, the public hungry for change and evidence is available, that's your sweet spot. If you're too far ahead, it'll be out of date by the time they need it. If you're too far behind, policy's gone, it'll just gather dust. So if you reflect back on everything we did, the most successful projects were just ahead of, but not too far ahead of the policy agenda. So the one that I skite about is our Rethink Plastic project. It was actually the first project that we did. We had an expert panel. We drew on a huge research network in New Zealand. Everybody wanted to be on the panel. We didn't want to make anyone grumpy. So we let them all into what we called our wider reference group. People put that on their CV. They didn't know it meant didn't quite make the panel. But that group turned out to be a hugely valuable resource. So we put it there as a kind of way not to make people grumpy and to build community. But we let everybody into the Dropbox folder. They could go in and edit the bit that they were the experts in. And it really, really, really built the quality of the work. So we did the usual thing. We wrote a thesis length document. Those are our headlines. We summarised it into a short report and we put it on a double-sided A4 for Wellington because no one reads past page 2. And everything went great. Because we'd done our homework, we'd made friends with the people at the Ministry for the Environment. They knew that the government really wanted to do something about plastic. It was a Green Minister, Eugenie Sage, who was super passionate about waste. So we had a PM, a minister, and a bunch of hugely talented officials from MFE who knew all about this problem already, hungry for the evidence. And we shared it with them ahead of giving it to the PM, which turned out to be unusual. Not all our projects we could do that. But that meant that when we got, this is pre-COVID, that's why I put the dates in, we got to the launch, we had a nice sunny day down by the water, announcements were made. And noting the date, even though the pandemic was on, we still managed to get those recommendations into the speech from the throne in 2020 to be all implemented. There's a story behind the Plastics Innovation Fund, which I'll tell you if you give me a wine, as to why that was highlighted in the speech from the throne. That doesn't happen every time. So I've over-egged the plastic story because that was our most successful one. But one thing we have learned is that science advice can be used well, misused, or completely ignored. So at the other end of the spectrum is this project, which we did on minimizing gang harm. So what we were trying to do in this project was not make recommendations, but synthesize what we knew about the adult gang environment in New Zealand. It was commissioned by one Prime Minister. It landed on the desk of another. I won't name him, that's kind of the reaction. And obviously, we'd missed that policy agenda sweet spot. So the policy agenda had shifted sharply. It was before an election now, and people were starting to worry about being tough on crime. This was not a popular message. To PM Hipkins' credit, he was very open to releasing the report. He didn't want to delay it till after the election, but there was no enthusiastic response or snacks down by the waterfront. Worse, I wrote the report with a very talented research analyst, Emma Brown, supported by Ian Lambie and Tracy McIntosh, who were experts in this area. And so we had a kind of press routine by then where I'd kind of so that I'd fronted to do the short interviews, and they would add more detail later in the more detailed pieces. So I got the morning report slot. I explained what it said in the report. We always offered briefings to opposition spokespeople, but they didn't always take them up on the time frame that the media needed. And so the then leader of the opposition played a soundbite, thank you Radio New Zealand, of something I'd said about the report, and had a knee-jerk media reaction, which was to say, I don't agree with any of that, I dismiss it. Hadn't read it, but that was what went out. So we got a citation in the UK Times, but for all the wrong reasons, for being rejected by the opposition. So that really didn't go well. So those are the two ends of the spectrum. And I've been thinking, as I mentioned, about how we might start to unpack in advance rather than just wait for that gut-dropping moment on Radio New Zealand, how to do this better. So I've drawn on some work of Roger Pilker and Claire Craig and oversimplified it to try and make it more accessible. So Pilker in 2007 described what he called tornado politics. And what I've done here is put these on a consensus quadrant. So on the y-axis there, you've got scientific consensus, which could be high, could be low. And on the x-axis, you've got values consensus, which is kind of a loose term for how much people are arguing about it, using values, not evidence. Now, if there's a major weather event like a tornado, the scientific consensus is pretty high. We know it's coming, we know roughly where it's going to go, we know you should probably stay inside, not stand in that wonky shed, tie down your trampoline, bring in your pot plants, don't lose your children, all those sorts of things. there is a thirst for that information because people don't want to lose their trampoline and they know it's a good idea and we all stay safe. So you're in the nice sweet spot where science advice is going to be useful and welcome. If, on the other hand, you're thinking about abortion, nobody really cares about the scientific consensus because that is a value that's deep, deep, deep. So every one of you in this room will have a very strong view on abortion, I'd say. You don't see people shrugging their shoulders. And that's quite correct. And that's based on your values, your upbringing, your religion, whatever else it's based on. But it's probably not based on scientific consensus. There might be bits around the edge, but not really. That's a values conversation. It should be a values conversation. Science advisor, probably go home. It gets really murky, and this is what Craig added to the conversation, when you have a low scientific consensus and a low values consensus. And that's often where you end up being asked hard questions. So we were in this corner of the woods when we did our work on the cannabis referendum, and happy to talk about that if anyone's interested. So if you've got something like recreational use of ecstasy, there's not much data because not many people want to sign up to say that they've taken it because it's legal. And values consensus around recreational drug taking is really odd. People have really extreme views. They overestimate the risk or they underestimate it according to whether they think they should be allowed to take it. And so you're just in trouble in that corner. It's unlikely that you're going to make much traction, but there are some tools where you can start to say, okay, here are the values, here are the scientific issues. Can you find ways to kind of portal into the bits of evidence you want? But it's not simple. And finally, because I wanted to complete the quadrant, I was looking for an example of where the values consensus is high, but the scientific consensus is low. And my best example so far is an asteroid. So if there's an asteroid about to hit the Earth, we're all going to agree we should do something about that. And scientists are not really going to have the slightest idea what to do. I'm really glad I'm going to miss it. I think there's one in 2032. So maybe thinking about where you are on the consensus quadrant before you start the project, rather than when you're on Radio New Zealand being shouted at by the leader of the opposition, would be a useful thing to do. And so I've gone back, looked at all the projects we did and mapped them out on the quadrant to try and see if that makes any sense. And one easy conclusion to draw is it's only in the top right that it's really safe or useful to make recommendations. You're likely to be asked for recommendations in other spots, and sometimes you will have to make them, but only in the red circle, I think, is it a good idea to make evidence-based recommendations, whereas around the edges, there are more sophisticated ways of synthesizing the evidence to move the conversation forward without ramming a particular policy direction down someone's throat. And of course, you don't necessarily stay still on the quadrant. So thinking about where to put COVID on this quadrant was instructive in that at the beginning, we were in asteroid territory. We all wanted to do something. Scientists, please help. So all our help was welcome, but we didn't really have a clue about this virus. So we were on basic principles. And ironically, as the scientific consensus lifted and we learned more and more about the virus, we lost people. So the values consensus shifted. So would it have helped to have thought about this harder at the time? Maybe. So maybe if we had been more explicitly aware of the problem we'd created, we would have been able to communicate better. Who knows? We'll try next pandemic. So we've got lots of challenges ahead. We all know that. And one of them is that decision makers have hugely different appetites for evidence. So I was lucky. I worked for 3 prime ministers who all commissioned reports and received them, albeit with different thirsts for detail. And I've taken my poster boy for not wanting evidence from the UK. That's Michael Gove, for anyone that doesn't recognise him, who was the person who famously said that Britain had had enough of experts. And of course, as those people start to take office around the world, we create a problem, right? So we all know that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And that is my all-time favorite Donald Trump quote that illustrates that point beautifully. From COVID, if we stop testing right now, we'd have few cases, if any. He is not wrong. So how do we communicate all the nuance and the complexity and the uncertainty in this ever more challenging global political environment when we're going to start all hesitant and contextualizing and say, we're not really sure, there's gaps in the evidence, we can only look under the lampposts. And RFK turns up and is very, very sure, very certain, and very wrong. So maybe the consensus quadrant is one tool to help do that. And just to finish, maybe this is another. So one of the things I've been thinking about is coming up with a set of guiding questions for getting started. Now, this is not for policy wonks and academics who deeply, deeply understand evidence and governance. This is for the 20-something-year-old policy person trying to find the right researcher in the university who might be able to help them with their policy brief that's due next Friday, or vice versa, the early career researcher who is trying to figure out what the government wants and how their evidence might be parceled so that it could make a difference. So it's just a set of questions for building relationships, for understanding the context that the advice is being provided into, and ultimately to just scaffold a conversation that creates trust, puts information in a form that's translatable and timely. Don't worry, I'm not going to do all of them because it's nearly snack time, but there are 15, and I thought I'd just flick through a few of them. So the first question, I think, is, can science help? And as I've just talked through on the consensus quadrant, often the answer is no, in which case, let's go do something else. So forcing evidence into a conversation that isn't thirsty for evidence is not going to be helpful. Presuming it can help, then how can it help? And I like this positioning as scientists at the service of decision makers. I have read Ian Boyd's book, which I will quote at the end. He hates that positioning. I think it's helpful to demonstrate a humility and a willingness to listen. And I note that we're not known for that as a tribe in science. And I think that if we did better at positioning ourselves as ready to help, people might listen more, but who knows? This is why I have to cite George, because I stole his diagram. So George tells me that good policy is acceptable, effective, and implementable. And I suspect that scientists in general could help policymakers find that sweet spot in any particular conversation. To do that, they're going to need more knowledge of the policymaking process, and policymakers might benefit from understanding that scientists can be good at things beyond their narrow sphere, like defining the problem, like identifying options in a systematic way, and also can help support evaluation of a policy intervention. Assuming you've framed the question, you've got the question and all the questions I've skipped over, I think who's asking the question and on behalf of whom is often not at all evident to researchers. Researchers are astonishingly unfamiliar with government, and I speak as someone who was when I went into it. And in both government and in universities and research institutions, it's impossible to find the right person. But you need a lot of time to fathom who's asking what question and why. So that's just an example from COVID. So I was a direct line to the boss, labeled boss there. And those other individuals were characters, I guess, in the daily COVID day. So there's a press secretary and minister. There's someone running civil defence and emergency. There's the head of the DPMC, and there's her chief of staff. All those people were asking questions. Some of them were asking them quietly. Some of them were asking them loudly. Sometimes you had to share with some of them or all of them. It was all about supporting the Prime Minister while maintaining your independence. Hugely complicated. So I remember, I don't think David would mind me doing this, Sir David Skegg coming into this conversation as chair of one of the advisory groups and just finding it unfathomable to work out where all the information was flowing and where he was to put his information officially and in the coffee room in order to have the best effect. It's hugely underrated amount of knowledge that you need to be effective deep in the heart of government, especially in the crisis. Also in a crisis, you end up giving informal advice, and that is normal. How long you extend that for, how long a crisis is a moot point. And informal advice can also be really useful for brainstorming and heads-up scenarios. So my last conversation with PM Luxon, we'd done all the formal bit and I delivered the report that he'd commissioned. And then he had a very warm conversation about what might be on my mind. If you were coming in as the new chief science advisor, what would you be worried about? And I gave a kind of bullet point list that I had in my head. And just at the very last minute said, oh, and space weather, because space weather was something that was coming up in the scientific community, and I was getting concerned phone calls from people around the trap saying they didn't know if government was ready. So I explained what space weather was in a fairly low-key way. And to my horror and delight, the next day was when we had that big storm. And I was able to give the best communication of my whole 6 years, which was to text, as discussed earlier. But I'm left with a nagging doubt that PM Luxon thinks I'm a witch. But the point of my story, apart from to liven it up a bit at the end, is that there's now a work program on space weather. And I got a text from the chief science advisor to NEMA the other day saying, I think you really helped on exit by just like raising that issue. So that informal advice, especially in a government that's not really into the nitty gritty detail, is hugely powerful, but also kind of risky, because if not all decision makers want formal evidence and you are relying on someone's reckons that's close to the PM, then you're going to have to be really careful to make sure that they're not just personal reckons and they're informed by deeper conversations. Informal advice is also helpful behind the scenes, and happy to chat about methane targets from the Carbon Zero Act when it was a thing later, if that interests anybody. I talked about things being on the policy agenda, and I just wanted to skim through, because the policy agenda is not always easy to ascertain, even when you're right in the heart of government. And the fact that there's no formal process for kind of raising issues can really frustrate researchers. Of course, when you get closer to government, you understand the briefings, the FIMs, the long-term insight briefings and things, and you have those relationships to try and influence what at least is put before ministers. But you need those relationships for that. Not everybody has them. So it's rare to find a published policy agenda. And sometimes, for example, in coalition arrangements, those documents are published. But if you're looking for a policy agenda, they only really serve to sharpen the focus of your despair. It's hard to know what's on the policy agenda and where evidence might fit. So sometimes you just have to put it on the policy agenda. And I had a wee go at that with the gene editing briefing I did for the PM after the Royal Society detailed report on it. So that was an opportunity that I took. Of course, if it's on the policy agenda and you're being asked for evidence, you need to be really clear whether the policy direction's already set or whether there's a genuine open mind. And both those paths are completely valid, but researchers sometimes walk into these conversations and don't realize that it's not an open question. So whether you're having evidence-based policy or policy-based evidence conversations is important. In both conversations, it's really key to evaluate interventions. So, for example, I told you the story of the gangs. When we had that conversation with the opposition, as they were then spokespeople, I took Ian Lambie with me, and he very quickly and adeptly pivoted from what we'd written in the report to how we might monitor any policy interventions that were introduced. And that's a really valuable piece of work that's being done. And it builds on the report, but perhaps not in the way that was originally intended. And I won't go to the smoke-free evidence space, but you can take that one as well. If it's not on the policy agenda, it needs political buy-in. It's got to be durable across election cycles. Jonathan's here, so I don't need to say that. The briefing on genetic editing, a lot of work went into getting Minister Parker for Labour across the line on some gentle, low-hanging fruit to see how we might move that conversation forward in the lab and in medicine. I always make the joke that the low-hanging fruit didn't include fruit, which is quite a big part of the conversation now. When the government switched, and I love this picture, it's got a kind of James Bond feel to it for some reason. Suddenly, the briefing that I'd written became part of National Party policy, which was fantastic, shows that it wasn't partisan, blah, blah, blah. But then the political consensus started to fracture. So it's fairly bruising trying to get things on the policy agenda. And those are just two recent headlines. So Labour was cautiously pro, but it's gone too far for them and too far for the Greens. And if you believe the news reports and the gossip on the terrace, the coalition might not get that bill over the line. So round the hamster wheel we go again, and we're getting nowhere with that one. So yes, it's great to be just the head of the policy agenda, but if you don't know the policy agenda or your really important issue isn't on it, then that's non-trivial to do. Finally, and that when I was first brainstorming my list of questions, I sent them to George, as I always do, and said, what have I forgotten? And he added this one, which I think is a useful one. What will you do if you are ignored? Which we were often. I think it's important to understand when you are advising governments and putting evidence together that you have to be patient. The evidence base is still valuable. If it's updated, if it's accessible, the next person can update it very quickly. Maintaining those relationships between officials and researchers and just between officials and different departments is important. Being ready to seize the moment when the political wind changes with that up-to-date report is important. And building public appetite for evidence-informed change is painful, but also important. So the last example I'll mention is a project we did on antimicrobial resistance. We said what all the other reports in the world have said about this, and many more will. It's in the top right-hand corner of the quadrant, but it lacks the urgency. We need Taylor Swift or Donald Trump to go down with something really nasty to lift it up in public opinion. There is just, the evidence just isn't cutting it. But when that moment happens, the evidence will be there and we'll be ready to go. And so I was at a great conference session where we had Andrew Old from the Ministry of Health, and we did the questions together because he was about to get eaten by all these researchers saying, but evidence, evidence, evidence. And we were managing to carefully unpack this evidence policy politics triangle and say, yes, keep giving the evidence to the policymakers, acknowledging that sometimes the policy politics line is broken. And while you're at it, try and elect somebody who wants some evidence. So final thought, and this is my food for thought. I mentioned the book by Boyd, Science and Politics, 2025. I don't agree with everything he says, but he makes some really interesting points and some really great challenges. And this is one that I'm taking on with me now. I've finished my book. That scientists need to learn to generate the narratives which are attractive to people, but which as faithfully as possible reflect the scientific paradigm, something we have traditionally struggled to do. And I hope that some of the tools that I've been thinking about and working on help us do that. But I think we've got a lot of work to do to find a way to communicate that we would like to help. There's a whole pile of evidence here that would make the world better. And we're not going to hang on to our precious rigor. We're going to be a bit more inclusive and try and move the conversation forward. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to the discussion.